Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome dear participants to the fourth module of the fifth week. In the previous module, we have discussed the development of the post-colonial theory and arguments, and also we have looked at the major terms which are used in the discussion of this particular theory. Today we would begin our discussion with the major theorists. For the discussion, I have taken up three major theorists and their main arguments: Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak and Homi Bhabha. We begin with the discussion of Edward Said's Orientalism and Otherness. Edward Said's famous treatise Orientalism, which was published in 1978, begins by giving us a very detailed account of the cultural representation of the Orient. The Orient, according to Edward Said, has been constructed as being a non-white and a non-European entity. It is not a natural entity as such, but it has been culturally constructed and promoted by the West. In the discussion of his ideas, Said has used innovatively the discourse analysis of Foucault as well as the knowledge and power dynamics of Foucault in order to explore how the production of knowledge is never innocent. It is always mired and designed into certain preconceived notions. The production of knowledge is also tied to the institutional discourses which mediate identity as well as community. And the concept of otherness, in fact, according to Said, lies at the center of his argument about the production and dissemination of the Orientalist discourse in the service of colonial ventures. So, we find that the Orientalist discourse is necessarily working in the service of the colonial ventures in order to support the imperialistic powers. The major arguments of Orientalism can also be taken up in a very summary manner. The Foucauldian insight about the production of knowledge, and that the production of knowledge is bound necessarily with power discourse, the operations of power, and it in turn generates social and cultural hierarchies, is a basis of Said's arguments. The knowledge about the Orient as it was formed and disseminated in Europe came to become an ideological accessory, and it justified the colonial empowerment. The colonized nations and their stature was justified in terms of white man's burden by the discourses which were deliberately constructed in terms of the Oriental's knowledge. The Orient, thus, according to Said, was a European invention. It was not about the Eastern and the non-Eastern societies and cultures. It was not an attempt to find out the differences between the two, or it was also not an attempt to understand the culture of the Orient. It was about the Western representation of the non-European cultures for a particular aim, and the aim was to present them in such a manner so that the hierarchies of the West could be continued without any challenge. So, the development of the study of the Orient and the discipline of Orientalism as such was concomitant with the control and infiltration of the East by the European colonial powers. In this attempt, the discipline of Orientalism was supported and reinforced by various other disciplines. For example, literary studies, history, anthropology, philology, philosophy, archaeology, etc., were based on a creative dissemination of derogatory ideas about the Oriental. So, in a way we would find that Orientalism became an institution. It also provided a lens to the Western powers through which the particular cultures could be viewed in a derogatory manner. Thus, as Luma has commented, knowledge about the colonized lands and power over the colonized lands were related enterprises, and the two cannot be separated in any way. So, we see that this idea of Orientalism reconfigured the study of colonialism in a major way. The formal and academic studies of the Orient, along with the literary representations and other cultural texts, produced certain ways of seeing and thinking that gave ideological impetus and justification for the spread of the empire. And here I am quoting from Said, a quote which is highly pertinent and which also suggests how the Foucauldian interpretations of knowledge and power nexus are central to our understanding of the post-colonial theory. Said argues certain texts are accorded the authority of academics, institutions and governments, and most importantly, as Said says, such texts can create not only knowledge, but also the very reality they appear to describe. So, what Said wants to suggest is the fact that certain texts have been deliberately created as a part of the Orientalist study program, which in a way disseminated not only knowledge about the Orient as they considered it to be, but also they created the reality about which they were trying to spread a certain knowledge which they were trying to describe. So, in fact, the reality itself was created by the Orientalist studies. Over a passage of time, such knowledge and reality produce a tradition which Foucault calls a discourse, whose material presence or weight, not the originality of a given author or an idea, is really responsible for the text produced out of it. So, we can say that a whole discourse can be created on the basis of the falsehood, and there is no attempt to verify the originality either of the author or the content which it purports to represent. Therefore, Said argues that representations of the Orient in European literary texts, in travelogues and other writings contributed to the creation of a dichotomy between Europe and its others. This dichotomy was also vital for the creation, for the survival and for the maintenance and expansion of European culture as superior and hegemonic. And it was the colonized understanding of European culture as being superior and hegemonic, which was a mainstay in further strengthening the colonial empire. So, the Orient was constructed as the other of Europe or the Occident. So, we find that the two binaries have been created, and the Orient has been relegated to a position in which it functioned as a distorted mirror image of the Occident. So, if we can say that Orient was lazy or treacherous or passive or feminine or inferior and sexually deviant, then the Occident has already been constructed as a binary which is privileged, and therefore, as a privileged binary opposition, it necessarily is energetic and enterprising. It is therefore reliable, active, knowable, masculine, superior and sexually pure. So, we find that the studies of Orientalists created binaries in which the West was privileged, and therefore, these studies gave a particular tainted understanding of what colonization, the process of colonization in fact is. Said further argues that owing to this nature of the discourse, the study of the Orient can never be objective or scientific, and it is mired in the particular colonial ideology. So, the vast and expensive knowledge of Orientalists which has been created by the West is steeped in culture bias, and it is based on a stereotypical understanding of the East. The aim was not to create a knowledge or a knowledge base, but the aim was to create a politically motivated vision of reality, where the structure used to promote the difference between the familiar and the other. Familiar was Europe, the West, us, the privileged binary, and the strange, the Orient, the East, them was the other, which was an underprivileged binary and therefore necessarily the evil one. Said therefore argues that when one uses categories like Oriental and Western, as both the starting and the end points of either analysis or research, or for that matter public policy. The result is normally to polarize the distinction. The Oriental becomes more Oriental in the process, the Westerner becomes more Western in this process, and therefore, they limit the human encounter between different cultures, traditions and societies. Said also underscores the essential questions of unequal power relations, focusing on how homogeneous cultural perceptions of the other generated under the colonial rule continue today through the differentiation of races as well as through the production and manipulation of knowledge. Said's idea is that this creation of knowledge under the Orientalist scheme of the West has not stopped, it is still continuing in one way or the other. Very much like Fanon, he wants to unmask the hegemonic ambitions of colonialism, but we find that whereas Said believed that the process of creating a necessary others is strongly aided by the use of language and circulation of produced and manipulated knowledge and narratives, Fanon on the other hand was mostly concerned with the psychological relationships between the two races. Said thus questions Western scholarship regarding the Orient and the belief that the Orient and its people are incapable of understanding themselves, or they are also incapable to speak for themselves. Another major theorist in the context of post-colonial theory whom I want to refer to during this module is Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. In her essay Can the Subaltern Speak?, Spivak has started by noting the inadequacy of Western theories of Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari in understanding the positionality of post-colonial subjects. In fact, she has constructed through this significant essay subalternity as a space of difference and also a space of impossibility of understanding the meaning of the speech of subaltern within the given frameworks that are steeped in Western thought, philosophy and the Western metaphysics. According to Spivak, particularly the subaltern women, women in the post-colonial world, women in the third world countries are excluded structurally from these frameworks that render it impossible to understand the speech act of the subaltern women. Spivak has undertaken a deconstructive approach that lays bare the institutions that inhibit the articulation of the voice of the subaltern women. She is critical not only of the colonial structures or the imperial structures, she is also equally critical of the Indian patriarchal institutions and shows how the patriarchal Indian institutions have also exploited the structural inequality of women in order to fulfill their own interest. So, in the views of Spivak, it is not only the colonial structures who have marginalized women, put her into the position of a subaltern whose voice cannot be heard, but it is also equally the responsibility of Indian institutions of patriarchy for putting the women into this impossible position. She has particularly studied the contradictory responses to the practice of sati in Bengal. We find that the studies of sati pratha, the tradition of sati in Bengal have been diverse and often contradictory. The colonial rulers have used the practice of sati to posit themselves as more rational, and thus they have appropriated for themselves an ethical position by banning this practice. Spivak wants to suggest that the colonial powers have strategically justified in their own exploitative structures the fact that they are saving the brown woman from the brown men. So, you would find that the post-colonial structures here are using or are constructing further the marginalization of women in a system of Indian patriarchal imperatives. She had further interrogated the institution of sati and suggests that it is not simply a practice that seeks to control the sexuality of women. In fact, it is not only a symbol of patriarchal subordination of women, where she is always considered as being subservient to her husband, but the prevalence of sati, particularly in those regions where women could have a possibility to inherit the husband's property, also points out the fact that this custom was an attempt to divest widows of property rights by appropriating and abusing the Hindu mythology of an ideal and chaste woman, and the purpose of this custom was not only to safeguard the suggested chastity of a woman, but also to safeguard the economic dominance of the men of the family. Thus, the economic rationale behind the practice of sati was couched in an ideological framework that made it impossible for women to contest and resist these instances of patriarchal exploitation. Spivak has also suggested and unearthed the oral and alternative narrative of young Bengali women who sometimes use suicide as a way to speak. In her death and through her death, women attempted to speak out against both colonial and sexist frameworks. But Spivak has argued that even when this subaltern woman is attempting to make an effort in death to pass on a message through her suicide, to speak, she is perhaps not being heard, because the act of speech is completed only when both speaking and hearing happen. But in these suggested cases which Spivak has taken up as pointer, we find that even though a woman is attempting to say something in the death throes, is trying to communicate a message through committing suicide, etc., through her death, her voice is not heard because it leaves no imprint on the patriarchal manifestations of power. So, Spivak is concerned with the impossibility of a speech act because it is centrally concerned with the unstable and categoristical nature of language. The idea of categories as a metaphor without an adequate literal referent is applied to Western notions of nation, nationalism, citizenship and multiculturalism, for which she suggests there is no adequate referent in post-colonial text, and therefore, it becomes a semantic misuse or error. In fact, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak is not basically concerned with examine how to create legitimate counter narratives. Rather, she is more interested in taking forward the deconstructive project by privileging provisionality and indeterminacy. Thus, she deals with shifting limits and meanings of knowledge and reflects on the ethics of representation, the politics of speaking for someone, narrating someone's experiences and stories in such a way that we do not necessarily appropriate them. So, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's contribution has been a very major contribution in which she has tried to align the post-colonial argument with the feminist arguments. In fact, keeping her points in mind, the question which she has raised, can the subaltern speak, can also be reconfigured and can be understood as a question like, can the subaltern be heard? Because if they cannot be heard, the act of speech cannot be completed. The subaltern by definition is someone who exists at the periphery of the symbolic order, and those who occupy such a marginal position are erased and rendered silent because of the various discursive practices which have been institutionalized, and that structure language in such a way that it only encodes dominant and hegemonic ideas, and therefore, the voice of a subaltern, particularly of a subaltern woman, can perhaps never be heard. So, it is within this framework that Spivak has politicized the issue of subalternity and claimed that a subaltern cannot speak because their speech cannot be heard or understood. Access to speech and thus access to self representation signifies an access to the symbolic order. Language is the law and the symbolic and political power too. A true subaltern lies outside of these structures, and Spivak has clarified in some of her interviews that if a subaltern is able to speak, or he or she does not remain a subaltern anymore. The third most important figure in the context of post-colonial theory is Homi Bhabha, who has talked about cultural diversity and cultural differences. He wants us to rethink our perspective on the identity of culture in a post-colonial world. He begins his discussions by drawing a distinction between what Braithwaite had called cultural diversity and what Bhabha terms as cultural difference, in a very clear allusion to the term difference and difference, which has been so central to the post-structuralist thinking and the postmodern arguments. The revision of the history, and I quote from Bhabha, the revision of the history of critical theory rests on the notion of cultural difference and not cultural diversity. Cultural diversity, according to Bhabha, is an epistemological object. Culture is an object of empirical knowledge, whereas cultural difference, according to Bhabha, is the process of the enunciation of culture, which makes culture as knowledgeable, authoritative, and therefore adequate to the construction of systems of cultural identification. So, if cultural diversity is a category of comparative ethics, as Bhabha says, through which statements of culture or on culture can differentiate, discriminate, is the process of signification which can be termed as cultural difference. Cultural diversity, according to Bhabha, is the recognition of pre-given cultural contents and customs, which is held in a time frame of relativism. It also gives rise to liberal notions of multiculturalism. These liberal notions, which are prevalent in the Western thought, the notions of multiculturalism, cultural exchange, or the culture of humanity, are innocuous and inoffensive. In fact, that the word which Bhabha has used for these liberal notions is anodyne. So, cultural diversity, according to Bhabha, thus represents a radical rhetoric of the separation of totalized cultures. These totalized cultures remain unsullied, they have not been tainted by the intertextuality of their historical locations, and they are safe, what Bhabha terms as the utopianism of a mythic memory of a unique collective identity. Bhabha thus suggests that the collective identity of these cultures is unique because it is not an exact memory, it is rather only a mythic memory, and that too it exists in a sphere which Bhabha has termed as a utopia. So, we find that cultural diversity thus may even emerge as a system of the articulation and exchange of cultural signs in certain imperialist accounts of anthropology. At the level of authoritative cultural representation, this enunciation of cultural difference may disrupt various understandings. For example, it may disrupt the division of past and present. According to Bhabha, the signification of the present involves the repetition, reconfiguration, and translation of tradition and the past, and therefore pastness is never a true or a faithful representation, it is always under construction, and therefore it disrupts the tradition, the relationship between tradition and modernity also. The iteration of the presentness of the past and the pastness of the present makes it impossible for us to look for the origins, and therefore it undercuts the homogenizing effects of cultural symbols and icons by questioning our sense of the authority of cultural synthesis in general, because as Bhabha has suggested, the present is also continually repeating, reconfiguring and translating the tradition as well as the past, and therefore the boundaries between the past and the present cannot be very categorical. He also further suggests that the cultures are not unitary in themselves. They are not only not unitary, but they are also neither simply dualistic or oppositional in terms of the self and the other. The idea of culture as a process of constant struggle suggests a critique of those values in the realms of aesthetics and political values which we normally ascribe to the totality of cultures. Particularly, we tend to ascribe certain values to those cultures which have retained a long and tyrannical history of domination and misrecognition. But if we consider that culture is a process of constant struggle, then we find that our understanding of these cultures is also to be changed. And according to Bhabha, it is this difference in language that is crucial to the production of meaning and ensures at the same time that meaning is never simply mimetic or transparent. We can also say that there are limitations of cultural diversity when articulated within a liberal paradigm, as it treats different cultures as mutually interacting and competing on the same footing. In this approach, we find that we assume the stance of cultural relativity, which also calls for cultural exchange, the tolerance of the diversity and management of conflicts through democratic means. Instead, we find that Bhabha has used the term cultural difference to underscore that the interaction of cultures in the post-colonial world is always imbued with power and authority. Differences arises not because these different cultures are existing side by side together, but it is manufactured through particular discourses at critical moments when the status quo is being questioned. Furthermore, the tension and anxieties which are elicited by cultural differences are always heightened by the issues of race, class, gender and sexuality, etc., as we have seen in our previous discussions. In fact, the differences of cultural diversity and cultural difference, as Bhabha has suggested, can be better understood with this particular slide, in which we find that they have been juxtaposed against each other. It is a reiteration of what we have already discussed, but it has been given in a particular shape for a better understanding. So, we find that Bhabha stresses the need to rethink the traditional notions of cultural identity which have informed the process of decolonization and the concomitant growth of nationalism. Post-colonial setting possesses an oppositional relationships between previously dominant culture and the other, and the imperialism may be understated and superstitious, but at the same time we cannot ignore the fact that it is still there. So, Bhabha's theory is to demand a reconfiguration of this relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. There has to be a zone in which the cultural relationship between the former colonies and the former colonized nations is able to transcend the historical antagonism between them. Bhabha feels that the other should not necessarily be perceived as being submissive. It should not necessarily be the one in which the first world capital translates into third world labor. And according to Bhabha, these two nations, this set of nations, the colonized and the colonizer, should be able to overcome the historical antagonism which has existed between the two. He has also talked about the third space. This idea of the third space attributed to Bhabha is a socio-linguistic theory of identity and community which is realized through language. It suggests that every person is unique and every person is also a hybrid of their own set of affinities or the identity factors which are unique to them, and therefore, this third space is a space of cultural exchange. It conditions and locations of social and cultural exclusion have their reflection in symbolic conditions and locations of cultural exchange. So, the idea of the third space comes from hybridity theory, which refers to a mixture of two different cultures or races. It also suggests that people draw on multiple resources to understand their world better and to create their own identity. Originally, we can understand the concept of hybridity as a cross between two separate cultures. It is not diversity, but hybridity. So, cultural hybridity is an in-between place which brings together contradictory knowledges, practices and discourses, and as Bhabha has said, same science can be appropriated, translated, rehistoricized and read anew. He talks in the context of the remixing of cultures. The third space, though is unrepresentable in itself, it still constitutes the discursive conditions of enunciation that ensure that the meaning and symbols of culture have no primordial unity or fixity. Bhabha concludes that by exploring this hybridity, this third space, we can transcend the politics of opposition and polarity and can think of reconstituting ourselves and our relationship with the others. When he talks about the reconstitution of the self and our relationships with the others, it has to be understood in the context of the post-colonial theory and in the context of the post-colonial past of a particular country. Bhabha also suggests that neither social capital nor cultural capital alone or maybe together are enough to overcome social exclusion. So, the third space theory suggests that policies of remediation based on models of the otherness are basically inadequate, and in order to achieve adequacy and self sufficiency, one has to overcome the politics of opposition and polarity. The concept of hybridity, which is originally a concept of horticulture, which refers to crossbreeding of two species of plants using different methods of grafting or cross pollination etc., has been used by Bhabha in order to create a new transcultural understanding within the context zone produced by colonization. Hybridization can also take many forms. For example, it can take up linguistic forms, as we have seen the idea of linguistic hybridity like pidgin and creolization of languages, and particularly it has been used Michael Bakhtin, who has used hybridity to refer to unsettling and transformative character of power of polyphonic languages and polyphonic linguistic situations. So, hybridization can take many forms. It can be linguistic, cultural, political or racial also. So, this term has gained currency with the work of Homi Bhabha, in which he has argued that the colonizer and colonized do not constitute oppositional binaries, as their relationship is one of interdependence. He argues for the mutual construction and reconstruction of the colonizer and the colonized identities, and he also argues that hierarchical forms of culture based on purity or originality are not possible anymore. Bhabha's idea of hybridity has also been criticized by several critics, particularly by Chandra Talpade Mohanty, by Benita Pari and by Aizaz Ahmad. They suggest that the emphasis on reciprocity hides the oppositional relationship between the colonial and the colonized cultures. It also promotes dependence on colonized cultures and ignores the hierarchical relationship on which imperialism has always functioned. The study in hybridity is seen as a tendency to dehistoricize and dislocate cultures from their particular context, be it spatio-temporal, cultural or linguistic, and this process thus promotes an abstract and a globalized and a textual concept of the post-colonial condition and ignores the specificities of cultural conditions as well as the specificities of experiences which different cultures and nations have undergone. A particular critic, Robert Young, has drawn our attention to the dangers of employing a term which is so rooted in a previous set of racist assumptions. And Young recalls how this concept of hybridity, the notion and the very usage of the word has had a checkered history which has problematized the extensive usage without qualifications. The word hybridity was used in a disparaging manner, in a critical manner, in a very negative manner to the union and mingling of different races in colonial and imperial discourses. It was a negative term which insisted that hybridity should not be used if one has to ensure the racist purity. Until the turn of the century, this word hybridity was a part of the colonialist discourse of racism, which frowned upon instances of mingling of the races, which was seen as an act which would destroy the purity of the European races. Another term which Bhabha has used is ambivalence. This is a term which was first used in the field of psychoanalysis to denote the persistent state of wanting something, desiring something and then not desiring it anymore. So, a simultaneous attraction towards something and a repulsion from the same object, person or action is known as ambivalence. This term has been used and appropriated by Bhabha into his colonial discourse theory. So, within post-colonial theory, it refers to the complex and complicated form of attraction and repulsion that characterizes the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. The relationship between the two is always uncertain and ambivalent because the colonized subject is never simply the other. The colonized subject is not simply necessarily opposed to the colonizer. Ambivalence, however, does not also suggest that some people may be complicit in their subjugation, and whereas some people may resist the colonizer. The idea of ambivalence is to suggest that complicity and resistance can exist in a fluctuating relationship simultaneously within the colonial subject. So, ambivalence also refers to the way in which colonial discourse affects the colonized subject. It can be both exploitative and cultivating simultaneously. So, ambivalence has been used by Bhabha to complicate and also to destabilize the authoritative aspect of colonial disposition and to question the significance and supremacy of the colonial discourse. It has challenged the authority of colonial supremacy because it disturbs the simple one-on-one relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Colonial discourse in fact depends on the production of those subjects who are bitemperamental submissive and who also replicate colonial beliefs, norms and values and systems. They mimic the colonizer, but at the same time they retain a submissive attitude. However, instead of that, colonial discourse ends up producing ambivalent subjects whose mimicry is never far away from mockery. So, thus ambivalence refers to this shifting relationship between mimicry and mockery. It essentially unsettles colonial discourse and dominance because it does not always disempower or dispossess the colonized, and therefore, Bhabha suggests that the colonial discourse is ambivalent or two-powered. Another important term which Bhabha has used is mimicry. We know how traditionally it has always been a very significant word in the context of literary criticism right from the days of Plato and Aristotle. So, according to Bhabha, the colonized subject mimics the colonizer by imitating the colonizer's cultural habits, their language, the attire, the values, the food they eat, etc. But in doing so, the colonized person is not necessarily being subservient. He can also mock and parody the colonizer, and therefore, we find that mimicry locates a crack in the certainty of colonial dominance and uncertainty in the control of the behavior of the colonized. So, Bhabha notes that mimicry is the process by which the colonized subject is reproduced as almost the same, but not quite the same, because it can contain both mockery as well as meanness. It reveals the limitations in the authority to the colonial discourse, almost as though the colonial authority inevitably embodies the seeds of its own destruction. So, we can say that mimicry describes the ambivalent relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, and this is a process which is never an exact reproduction of the colonial trait. It is always steeped in certain ambivalence, and then we can also say that it is a site of challenging the certainty of colonial discourse. I would refer to what Ashcroft and others have said in this context, because they say that mimicry also shows how the colonial discourse control of the subject is always already ambivalent. The threat inherent in mimicry then, according to Ashcroft, comes not from an overt resistance, but from the way in which it continually suggests an identity not quite like the colonizer. So, mimicry is a process in which the colonized subject is reproduced as almost the same, but not quite. The colonized person may copy the colonizer's culture, their behavior, their manners and values, but at the same time the colonized can also mock the colonizer, and there may be a certain meanness involved in this process. So, mimicry in a way exposes the inherent limitations of the colonial power, its ambivalence, and thus the discourse of colonial authority unavoidably contains the seeds of its own destruction. So, we find that these three theorists have given a particular shape to the post-colonial argument. In our next discussion, we would look at certain literary products as a case study to understand the implications of the post-colonial theory in literary reproductions. Thank you.